Neela, thanks so much for coming on an N of One. It's such a pleasure to have you on today. And you and I have known each other a fair long time.
I don't know how we met, but your name's popped up everywhere. We've virtual, I don't know. I don't even know. Yeah.
Nobody ever knows in behavioral science how you met another behavioral science. We're like ships passing in the night. It's like, I don't know. There's not that many of us.
Yeah, there's not that many of us.
So, you've heard the podcast before. You know how this works, right? We spend so much time as behavioral scientists looking at the norm, the median, the sort of every person, because that's who we affect, right? We're trying to affect large numbers of people. But we sometimes lose track of those N of one stories. And so today I want to help tell your N of one story. And I want to go all the way back. I want to talk about like 6 or 7 year old Neela. Like, who was six? Like, how would people have introduced sort of 6 or 7 year old Neela?
Probably, grew up in India, probably very absent-minded 6 or 7 year old Neela. I think I just love to read and, grew up in the 80s. So there was no social media, no phones, no nothing. There was one version of Donkey Kong, which you could get on a little like those video game things, in your hand where you could press with the buttons. But since it was shared between 4 cousins and me for our summer breaks, you could get it for like a long time. So basically there's nothing to do except go to the local library and read. And as far back as I can remember, I loved reading. And I think my first memory actually, and this is both a reading and a kindness memory, is if you grew up in India in the 70s and 80s, you got every single disease known to people. You got malaria, you got mumps, you got measles, chickenpox. So it was one of those things. I think it might have been jaundice or something that I missed an exam. And in India, the exams were very important to your grade. So I didn't end up getting, the prize because I missed the exam. But my first grade teacher, and I still remember her name, Teacher Marilyn, she was so nice. She invited me for the prize giving ceremony and she said, no, you should sit. And because she knew I would miss the prizes, she got me a book as a prize. She probably spent her own money to get the book as a prize. And the book was about, I think it was Greek myths, and it was written in a children's format. It was really nice. I still remember it was a green covered book. So anyway, books and like kindness have been long in my memory. I love to write. When I was, I think in 4th grade, so we had to write for our school magazine. So I wrote some poem. The next thing I know, some parent comes to the principal and she says, you can't publish this poem in the school newspaper. And the principal says, why? It says, because she hasn't written it. It's not written by her. You can't have like whatever age I was, 7, 8, 9 year old, write this. It's written by her parents. So then they had me sit in a room and write another poem just to show I could write. But that's my earliest memories, like reading, lots of writing. And, but I think I was, all around pretty good at other stuff as well. So, math was fine, but reading and writing was really my main spike, I think. Yeah.
I love the idea of like little Neela in a room having to prove that she knows how to write poetry. I'll write a second one. That's the most,
exactly.
That is the most behavioral science thing I've ever heard. You present a result and somebody's like, that's not real. You can't change behavior that way. And you're like, I'll do it again.
That was a replication study, the original one. Right?
I will do it again. I will prove that it works.
There's nothing I can do to convince you, so I might as well just write another poem, right, and show you that it can. But yeah, that was Neela.
That is amazing.
Oh, and then I was also I think my parents would say I was very, very stubborn, so maybe that had a little bit to do with it.
I mean, it is. We've done enough of these now that the N of one is an N of something, and I do think there's a little bit of that tenacity, grit, stubborn. Like, I want to use evidence and I want to prove this thing and I want to sort of, there's a little bit of a hunger for like understanding that part of the world that manifests as determination in a positive light.
An argument. I remember like my parents saying that you should be a lawyer because, there was nothing else I preferred to do than to argue with them on everything. But like, yes, that love for reading and argument and writing, that as far as I can remember is probably like the earliest memory that I have. Yeah.
And does that show up as you move into like middle school, sort of older years? Does that show up? Does that sort of carry out?
Yes, always showed up, but I didn't really, like, it did show up. I was always on the school magazine committee, taking part in the debates and the plays. So that expression did show up. And then, so in India, you go through K to 10th grade in our case, and then 11th and 12th, you do, at least in Bombay where we were, you did it in a separate, they called it junior college, and then you went on to the 3-year undergrad program. So I think it always showed up, but I never took it seriously because it wasn't a way to have a livelihood. There was no way you could convert writing into a reasonable paying livelihood. So it was always one of those nice to do things that were like, yeah, I'll do that, but never as a writing career, no.
What did you think you were going to do? Like if we asked sort of 7-year-old Neela, like, what are you going to be when you grow up? Was there a like aspiration towards something?
No, that's so funny because people say, sometimes they're like, oh, think back to your 7-year-old self and what you'd like to do. And my 7-year-old self never thought of any job, I mean, or any way of being. So I don't know whether it's lack of imagination or what it was, but I knew I didn't want to be like an astronomer, and I don't like heights, so I never wanted to do risky stuff. Now, once you cut out all of that, and I didn't really want to be, although I do have a memory of me playing with several dolls and telling someone, oh, how wonderful it is that I have 6 children. So clearly I thought there was something. Now I have only one out of choice. So clearly that changed. But, I don't remember really thinking about what Neela would like to do. It was more like be a good student, and then play with friends and spend your summers at your grandmother's place, and that cycle really just repeats itself. And there wasn't much, and do the things that you enjoy, like going to the library. And there wasn't even a lot of conversations around that, which is quite different from now. My daughter's a junior in high school, and the kinds of conversations about, your career and that was very different. I don't even think that existed.
And so at some point you have to, you're going to junior college, you're going to college, you're going to have to study something. So,
yeah.
If we fast forward a little bit and you're in high school, like what does high school Neela think? I mean, are you on that lawyer track? Have you listened to the advice of your parents and you're going to argue with the world?
There's one exam at the end of 10th grade, which really determines whether so in India it was pretty set at that point. You either went into what was called a science stream, what was called a commerce/accountancy, or what was called arts, which was the humanities and social sciences. And sciences were the hard sciences, and physics, chemistry, biology, etc. And it was basically decided, the cutoffs for each of those were decided on your marks in the school leaving examination, with science being the highest cutoff and therefore the most prestigious, and then was accountancy and arts typically being the lowest cutoff, and this idea. And it had the least amount of maths, actually. And economics was clubbed with the arts. So the one thing I did, which I don't really know like how I thought of it at that point, but I did extremely well in my school leaving exams, and everyone assumed that I was going to go into science. And then you did 2 years, and you typically either did medicine or you did engineering, if you went into science. And I remember saying, no, I would do that. And people were shocked. And I remember this. So my mother was a lecturer in economics. And this fellow lecturer came up to her and said, so what is she going to do? And my mother said, oh, she's going to take up arts. I think she wants to do economics. And he said, but why? Like, she's got the marks to do science. And she said, but you teach economics. But, there was such a strong, stigma around, someone who did well going into that. People couldn't just figure out. But that was a little bit of that stubbornness as well. And I do have to say, I think my parents were extremely supportive about that. My mother knew I had no interest in science. I did well, but that's because I just forced myself to study it. Actually, not even forced myself to study. So it turned out I had a very good memory. So I decided rather than understand physics, I would just memorize the whole physics textbook, because it was just easier that way, and the whole chemistry textbook, because they would only ask questions from that one textbook. And I figured it was just way easier to memorize the textbook than it was to actually understand what was going on there. And so I did really well in those exams without understanding anything. But I knew pretty much that I was not going to be successful there. So in some small act of, not rebellion, because I don't think my parents were, I wasn't rebelling against that, but maybe societal rebellion. I was like, no, I'm going to go into the arts field, not even commerce, not even like accountancy. I'm just going to go into the arts field. So that's what I did in class 11 and 12. And then I think the turning point, so after class 12 is when you decide you're going to, there's another exam, and then you decide what you're going to specialize in. So if you're in the arts field, you can then choose what your major is going to be. You have to decide that before you go to college. It's a 3-year undergrad, and you have to, and there were certain combinations. So you can't take, for example, economics and English. Very few colleges would offer that, or none, I think. So if you took economics, you could take economics, math, stats, or economics and political science. If you took English, so there were certain combinations. I remember 16 or 17 of those. So that was when I really had to decide, do I want to do like English, or do I want to do, economics? Here's the interesting one. I think it was grade 11 or 12. We had some sort of aptitude test. They said, oh, we'll do this thing and see what you have an aptitude for. And the other day I pulled out that aptitude test. I still have it from, God knows, 30, 40 years ago. And it said, and I laugh about it. So it said that I had very low aptitude for the sciences, which I knew. It said I was very creative, so high aptitude for writing, etc., which I knew. And it said I had no aptitude for social work whatsoever. Okay, so I should not go into any social work profession, which makes me laugh because, I'm in some sort of thing of that. But it was and it said I could become an accountant. So the aptitude thing said I loved order, and I loved, things that had to do with order and with some sort of reasoning. So it was really weird because on the one side, it was you could be a writer or you could be an accountant. So that was kind of that's always been two sides of me, like where do you reconcile those? So to choose my major, I finally decided to go for economics versus doing, say, English literature. I think partly because, obviously the opportunities afforded by economics are a little better, but also because weirdly enough, I like the community better. So there's a very rational, practical side of me. And I found the English major very interesting, but on their own planet. And I was like, oh my God, this is nice to dip into once in a while, but I don't think I want to be, so identity, I don't think I want to be that person. I identified more with the economic students and the economists. And so that was actually, I think, a little bit of that turning point in deciding, what that major is likely to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think certainly the people you're surrounded with is a huge part of it. Who you gravitate towards and empathize, and I love writing and I love words like you. I love, reading constantly and all of those things, but I would not have been, the English majors were not my people. That was not my clan.
And it was such a intuitive decision. I don't think that it was, I thought, and this is sort of, we often say these big decisions that you make, right, with the gut, and they're often, there's that whole, and I do think it was very intuitive. Even till today, I cannot explain why I would not have chosen that. And in fact, it was so funny because I had a friend who called my mother and said, but why is she doing English? She seems to love writing, and her writing gets published and so on. And I said, no, I just don't want to do it. So that was that. And I enjoyed economics.
Neela, you're getting in trouble for everything, man. Why aren't you doing the sciences? Why aren't you? You can't win.
Yeah, it was interesting, but it was fun. So I enjoyed economics. I think it was quite interesting. Yeah.
When you went into your undergrad and started actually studying it, did the contents of the cereal box match the cover? Did you feel like, oh yeah, this is what your mom was in econ, so you sort of had some vision of what it was like.
Yeah, so that wasn't too surprising. I do think that I did realize early on that I had very little, I would say, natural talent for the kind of careful reasoning that economics requires. I like to have flashes of insight, which is not conducive to when you're trying to do like linear algebra and so on, and do the deductive, inductive. Those things give me nightmares. And I like to pull together different facts, and then suddenly I'll be like, oh, I love synthesizing things. I don't much like reasoning. So micro in particular, microeconomics is very much about first principles. And I could never understand, like, why this curve? Like, why does it matter? Why x-axis and y-axis? You can't ask those questions. You have to assume certain things, you know. So that was kind of interesting. But in my third year, and I still remember, although I didn't do much about that, we had a course called Development Economics. So the two ones I really enjoyed are History of Economic Thought, which was really interesting. And then we had this course called Development Economics. And I still remember, we had a paper by a Pakistani development economist called Mehboob al-Haq. And I remember reading that paper, and this was the time when everyone was talking about we need to have this big push to get economies out of poverty. And he actually said, yeah, that's great, but what about the redistribution of income, not just, increasing income? And that was actually not that popular or not that well known. Like, a lot of development was about, increasing income. And I don't know what happened. I still remember that I was like, wow, that is such an interesting perspective, that you need to redistribute income as much as you need to grow incomes. That really stayed with me. So those two courses I really, really enjoyed, but I didn't do much with them. And then after that, of course, you have to decide what to do. That's the next turning point after college. And typically in India at that point, you didn't really go into work immediately, especially if you were a high achieving student. You typically went in to do some master's degree, whether that was, so again, there are two forks in the road. One is to do an MS in economics, and the other one was the MBA. Everyone was, talking about MBAs. They were very much in the consciousness. And I don't know, I didn't feel like I wanted to specialize. So I went in to do like the MBA, and that's really how I got into management and the MBA. Yeah.
And did you have a thought? I mean, as you're going to this MBA program, did you have a thought that oh, I might still go back to economics, or I might still go back to the academe, or I might, I'm going to do this MBA and then I'm going to kind of go back to the thing? Or
yeah, so it was really interesting. The first was in the MBA, the first time I'd encountered marketing, which was actually super interesting. So the first time in my life, I think I felt like this whole arts part of me and the science part of me was coming together. It wasn't, so I didn't gravitate to finance, strategy, none of that. It was marketing. I felt, oh, that's really interesting. We had to take a certain subgroup and do a paper on consumer behavior, and I chose nuns. Because I was like, I wonder if are they consumers of anything? I mean, the whole idea with nuns is, you take a vow of poverty, you're not supposed to be consumption oriented. So how can we call them consumers? What would they be consuming? So it was quite interesting. I had to go and interview some nuns. I think we did find some strands of consumption behavior, but obviously, as you might expect, not very strong. But it was kind of interesting to think through that, right? So marketing was really the thing that I thought, oh, this could be quite interesting. But frankly, I didn't really have any thoughts of it. But again, this is so funny. People tell you things that you don't realize. So we went through business school, and I joined Nestle. And a fellow colleague of mine from Nestle, he was going in to do a PhD in finance. And then he turns to me and says, well, have you thought of doing a PhD? It looks like you might be well suited for it. I had never given the impression of wanting to do a PhD, never spoken about it. So this was kind of like, what? And I just filed it away. But it was, again, an interesting data point where other people sometimes see you and you don't know yourself at that point. And I was like, I don't know what led you to make that remark, but but it was an interesting remark. So no, I hadn't thought about it at that point. It was very much the go into business, go into a nice large corporate and do really well, and just make it to whatever level you can make it to. Very much that in the early stages.
And why Nestle? I mean, how did that you sort of in a very particular sort of salesy kind of role?
Yeah. So, the nice thing with India in the 90s is when, so most of the companies, there were no tech companies, and even Coke and Pepsi came in a little later. So it was a traditional CPG companies, Unilever, Nestle, Colgate, that had the marketing jobs. Then there were a lot of the banks that had marketing jobs, Citibank and so on. But it was very well known on campus that if you wanted to be a real marketer, you went into these hardcore marketing jobs. And they were actually pretty fabulous. I think it was a model started by Unilever. The first 3 years of your marketing career, maybe even more than 3 years, you had to be in what they call sales, which is distribution. So they would not send you to the head office to do brand management. They would send you out to some remote area. And obviously for women at that point, given safety considerations, remote was relative, but they would send you out to some small town. You would be given 2 or 3 what they call distributors, which is these like 50, 60-year-old men with an immense experience. And you would have to manage them and the sales team, which is a bunch of another 50-year-old men, only men, who, are now seeing this 22-year-old with no experience who's supposed to be telling them how to do sales. And I think it was fabulous because the idea was that if you didn't know how the product moves in the market, you cannot be a good marketing person. And I even now, even in the nonprofit world, that's what I say. Like, you cannot be sitting in a funder's office unless you've actually like pounded the pavement and seen how a program works and worked in that environment for a few years, because you just have to have that experience up front. So Nestle was, and that was also interesting because I had another job, I think it was Colgate and so on, which is pretty good. And Colgate was an interesting one. In India, Colgate was not seen as a multinational. So in India, multinationals at that point had the significant premium image versus local Indian companies. So everyone wanted to go into multinationals. And multinationals were not seen as, Colgate was not seen as a multinational. It had done such a good job of integrating into the Indian landscape that people did not know Colgate was an American multinational. And so when I called my mom and told her I got this job, and she said, well, it's an Indian company, isn't it? And I was like, even I didn't know that actually. And it took me years to realize that their headquarters were in New York City. I mean, Bata is the other example of a company that is Canadian or Swiss, and everyone thinks Bata is Indian because for some reason it's so well integrated. In a way, they don't think Unilever or Nestle are Indian. So anyway, so Nestle, why I chose Nestle over Colgate, I think was food. I'd always liked food. My mother is a great cook. So we had good meals. We always went to like good restaurants. We ate well. My grandmother was a fabulous cook. So I liked food. So the thought of like selling food or having something to do with food was much more attractive than toothpaste. So I joined Nestle.
Toothpaste is important too. It's after the food,
I would actually now, I think maybe it's just seeing like food companies are kind of gray tinted because, there's been a lot of discourse about what they do to get that growth. I'm thinking, maybe like being in a toothpaste company, it's an unequivocal good, like a toothpaste company. No one can brush their teeth too often, like it can never be harmful. But yeah.
Yeah.
But it's these little things. I mean, it's the point, I think, is these decisions get made on the flip of a coin. I mean, you don't really think, and it's such a, what do they call that, path-dependent process that at that point you don't think about like, why did I choose this versus, this just sounded better, the name sounded better, so I chose that.
I thought it was a multinational versus I thought it was the weirdest named Indian company ever.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I chose it. But yeah.
Colgate. And you kind of bounce around early in your career. You know, you do these sort of classic 2 to 3 year stints.
Correct.
First at Nestle and then at Best Foods and then at Unilever, right? And sort of, working your way through the sort of food bit. And then there's a bit of a right or left turn there that happens as you go off to Accenture. Like what was the Unilever to Accenture path?
So I think you're right. There was a little bit of, I think, searching there in terms of, so Nestle was a very well-run, very well-established company where I felt like, okay, I'm just in this very well-run company. Nothing's happening. Like, I mean, they were making such good products. They were making profits hand over foot. There was good marketing, but there wasn't really a lot of challenge, I didn't feel. And at that time, Best Foods had come in and they had knocked the socks off the soup market. And this is a market in which Nestle had like a monopoly over that market. And in 2 or 3 years, Best Foods had come in with at that time, the Knorr brand, and they had just taken over the market. It was such a David and Goliath situation that it really intrigued me because I was like, how do you do that? And by the way, when I was in Nestle, one of the interesting things I thought, and maybe that contributes to like the choices and the searching is, so Nestle had launched this phenomenal product called 2-minute noodles, okay, which is basically instant noodles. They had created noodles that was not eaten in India except in the Northeast, and they had created this entire multi-million-dollar category in India in the space of a few years, this ready-made instant noodles. And I remember thinking to myself, I wonder who introduced that product. And I said, if I introduced a product like this, I would just retire and live off the memories. I mean, that would be such a legacy. So I think that was quite important. Like, what would be the legacy?
You just want one mic drop campaign, baby.
I just won. And later on, I thought that with Pepsi, I was with Lay's. I was like, oh man, if I was the one who invented Lay's chips, I would just have that's it. Nothing could top that, And then I would just have. So I think this idea of the search was, I think, in search of what is that magic? Like, where do you get to do that? And Best Foods was, it was interesting because it's such a scrappy underdog. So I joined Best Foods just because of the interesting work. And then back to Unilever because I had done my summer placement there. Back to Unilever because they gave me a chance to be in sales in North India, which was really interesting because I was not very good at the language either. I remember they used to have numbers in Hindi, and although I understood Hindi perfectly well. You don't really remember all the numbers in a particular language. But my salesman would be telling me that, okay, we're going to do X tons. And there were no phones at that time. So I remember calling there were mobile phones, but not like the internet. So you can't do what does this mean? So I remember having a halt to the meeting and calling my then boyfriend and saying, now husband, and saying, I'd written the number phonetically, and I said, what is this number? Tell me what this number is. And he would tell me in English, and I'd be like, okay, I need them to do X. How do I say that? Because I didn't want to lose credibility with this team. But anyway, so that was an interesting. So I think challenge has been that kind of, if I get too comfortable somewhere, I get a little antsy, and then I want to do something that's a bit challenging. So then the consulting came about because a friend had moved to Anderson Consulting. It was called at that point. It was the last year before they were changing over to Accenture. And at that point, Accenture was looking to hire people with sales and marketing skills, which was quite rare. They hadn't done that previously. And she said, it's interesting and you've had a few years now. Would you like to join? And it was very much that would sound interesting. Instead of doing one job, I could do several projects. Why not? I had no idea what consulting was, but I thought, how bad can it be? Went to the office. It was a beautiful office. So I was totally seduced by the office and said, the contrast was very strong. I was on the field in distributor offices where, there's this one fan overhead and that kind of thing. And at that point, even now, I think sadly in India, there are not good public toilets for women. So I remember doing all these sales stints where you couldn't go, and my boss, who was male, would happily dash into a restaurant, and I can't use, there's no toilets for women on the way, so you just don't do anything. So that's the contrast between that and this lovely consulting office, I think, was just too great.
Air conditioning and toilets,
So I don't have a good reason. People ask me, I say, one day I'll make up a story about my career thoughts, but the unfiltered story is that it was just a physical environment. It turned out to be very good. I actually really enjoyed it. I mean, I think I could have, of all the stints I had, that would have been, and it's funny because I keep saying I want to do something. We talked about this before, that I want to do something for the next many years that's consistent. But at that point, that constant sequence of projects was really exciting and interesting. So it was it's probably, and I hadn't reached the stage yet where that sometimes tapers off because of impact, right? It was still at that intellectually exciting stage. So yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a career arc there where it's, in the beginning, you're just excited to be doing anything. And after a while, you're like, none of this is doing anything. There's no.
And I was very much but I had started to think about, okay, what now? And, now you've been 8 years in the workforce, 8 or 9 years. And I was seeing a pathway which was, okay, I'm going to be CMO somewhere. If I get off, I could become partner in the consulting firm, but then I was starting to see that, then it's going to become a series of, I need to sell these projects. And you don't really get to work on seeing that translated into any sort of impact. And the success of the project is how many more follow-on projects you sell, not necessarily, the results that you're driving. So I was beginning to see that and to see that, I don't know if I want to do that. I think I was also, consultants use data, but there's a lot of confirmation bias in the data, in the sense of, it's very much to prove a point, and the point is often, and with all good, it might be a good way, it's intuition, expertise, but it's very much used, in that sense. And I was a little dissatisfied with that because I felt like, you should use that to examine a point. And there's a lot of confidence that you have to display that I wasn't very comfortable with. I wanted the search versus the confidence. So I was beginning to see a little bit of that. But then the other parts were not interesting enough. I was like, well, what am I going to do? Just be a CMO, in one of these large companies. So I was, again, casting around for things to do. And that's when I was like, that old thought of, oh, maybe I could do a PhD. And what happened was that at one of the consulting projects, so we were doing this for actually a very large Indian company, and they are the most savvy. I mean, especially if the founders are still there, they are the most savvy people ever. The guys often, especially the founder themselves, would not have had a great education by how we define education, but they are so sharp. And I remember we were doing this thing about the master brand of the company extending into different categories. And we said, well, you have this advantage of natural. And so he was like, yeah, but what does natural mean to people? Like, is this natural? Is that natural? And so what we were trying to do is just put together from our own anecdotes the meaning of natural. So I was like, surely there must be something. By that time, Google had happened. So I Googled a little bit and I found this academic article, and I think it was Paul Rosen at Penn who wrote about the meaning of natural, and he had done various little experiments and asked people like, okay, if you mix orange juice with this, if you remove some fat from milk, and not having any theory about what was natural, but just running these little experiments and then decide. I found that totally eye-opening. I mean, very interestingly, when I did marketing in the 90s, there was no mention of this kind of work. We were still learning the Kotler textbook, framing, positioning, segmentation. There was no, so this was completely separate. And psychology in India, you didn't really do a lot of social psychology. You did much more like cognitive, maybe clinical. So this was so new. And I was like, wow, like someone is actually sat down to think about what this means. What is the meaning of natural in this scientific way? And I was like, okay, that could be cool to do. So that was like the PhD.
Well, and what a great intro, right? Paul has this great, I mean, he really, he is sort of a hypothetical going in. He's just sort of walks around a little bit,
And I later on, I took his classes at Penn, and he was on my dissertation committee. And it's just that absolute curiosity with like, what's this question? Let's explore it. No, let's publish this in the top journal, or it was pure. Like I haven't seen anyone with that degree of just pure like, oh, this is fun. Like it was just fun to explore these kinds of questions. But yeah, that paper was really eye-opening. It was really cool.
Well, and because he's working in food, right? He works with Monel and stuff.
Yes.
Like, it has this sort of universal language. I always love that paper about like how male or female, masculine or feminine is the meat, right?
Yes, yes, I love that paper.
It's just, he sort of like has an observation. He's like, oh yeah, and people do sort of treat it this way. I wonder if we could investigate that.
And I think what I really liked, and that was the other thread, is that he takes sort of cultural exploration seriously. So a lot of, behavioral science is very Western coded, weird, as we call it, etc. And he was one of the people who was just always, as soon as he knew I came from India, he was so interested, and he would pepper me with questions, most of which I couldn't answer because I came from like upper middle class Bombay, which is hardly representative of India. And I grew up Catholic in a predominantly Hindu country. So like I'm not representative at all. But, he would just ask these questions that really made you sort of step back and think about it. But yeah, that entry, I did not know at that time that he was at Penn. I don't think I registered that, but that was very much my entry into this could be an interesting profession. So like, let's go do a PhD. It didn't hurt that all the PhDs were funded. So again, this is my inherent financial risk conservatism coming into play. I was like, oh yeah, it could be cool to do this.
Well, and yeah, I mean, coming from a first generation college family, like when they find it, my parents were like, they pay you to go to school? Like, didn't we just pay for this? And I'm like, yeah, apparently it's the other way around now. I don't know.
So it was I was like, wow, I mean, yeah, why not? And it's the time value of, and now people say, oh, it's expensive because the time value of money is there. You're spending 6 years, 5 years. that's not so apparent at that point. I was like, what am I going to do anyway? I'm going to take up some, so I might as well just go do this. So again, not very well thought through. And then, of course, when you write your applications, you've got to say whether you want to do broadly quantitative work or consumer behavior. And I knew I wasn't going to be doing the quant work, and I don't even think I had the math background to do that. So and I gravitated towards the consumer behavior part. So that was it. But I was a very non-traditional student, because even at that point, and we're talking like 20 years ago, and now it's even more, is students from undergrad were the norm. And I had had 8 years of work ex by that point, more than a few of the professors even. So that was kind of untraditional.
And did you think, oh, I'm going to get this PhD and then go back to private industry, or did you think I was going to the academic? Like, what was the
No.
PhD and then what?
Yeah, no, but I think that I did want to keep options open. So there was a part to me that said, and again, this is all based on my fantasies of life as a professor in the ivory tower. And I would never have to do any networking event ever, because I would just be writing papers, maybe a novel in my spare time, that kind of stuff. And it was completely unfounded in any reality. But
there are a lot of tweed in Neela's mind,
Yeah, exactly. I think I somehow mistook a marketing professor for a professor of classics or something. And I was just like, oh, I'll be wandering to these like ivy-strewn campuses and lecturing to groups of undergrads. No, so I thought that would be would be an interesting life, and the marketing positions were well paid, the tenure track position. So I was like, oh, that looks like a very interesting life. But there was a part of me that said, okay, I should keep my options open. So, Penn seemed like a good mix. It wasn't, if I'd only decided on the basis of academia, Penn had a much more open sort of curriculum. They didn't really force their students to publish early or to jump onto a professor's research in order to get a head start. They're very much find your own way for 2 years, which isn't like the best thing in a publish or perish industry, because you could turn out to have nothing really at the end of it. But I liked that, and I thought, okay, that's a nice mix between I didn't want to go in and then follow someone else's rules again, And a few of the universities, when I was chatting with them, they were like that. They were like, from the first year, we're going to put you on this professor's research, and then by the end of your first year, you'll have a paper. And I was like, I haven't left 8 years to, go and follow another set of rules. So I think that appealed to me a little bit. But there wasn't any idea. It was more the idea that I was going to become a professor. Yeah.
And then at what point did that shift? I mean,
yeah,
you're going through this PhD, you're doing the thing, you think you're going to be a professor. You obviously don't, right? There are other chapters on here. So what?
Yeah.
Why do you think that shifted?
Yeah, and I think this is where I tell people that no matter, and I do a heck of a lot of research before I jump into something. I tell people, I don't know, maybe I missed the research, or there are some things you just have to experience. You can't actually, you can't decide how you feel. So the one thing I learned about myself was that I love, and I still love, synthesizing. The literature review was my favorite part of doing anything. I did not have the patience to construct studies. I literally did not have the patience. I could read other people's studies. I could critique them. I would ask the so what questions. But at the point when I had to do my third study, and they said, should we have the 5-point scale or the 7-point scale, and I was just like checked out of it. So I realized that and this is like a little bit of the microeconomic thing. I just didn't have that careful, the idea that I would publish a paper on a very narrow topic, and that I would do many of these over many years, and then eventually maybe publish something that more than 5 people read. That was just, it wasn't me at all. So then I quickly realized, and to be fair, that's what academia is based on, and that's been a successful model. So I saw no reason that they should change for me. And so I was like, okay, Neela, you're just not going to, and a lot of people said, I did get tenure. So I went in the job market, because again, hedging my bets, and I told my advisor, I'm not sure I want to go on the market. And she's like, well, you might as well go. So I probably was the least anxious job market student ever, because by that time I was 90% sure I was not going to go into academia. So it was just a fun set of presentations, and I walk in, to these meeting rooms with professors, and I'm doing my job market talk and they ask me questions. I don't really care, so I just answer. I'm not like, oh, this famous professor is going to like derail my entire career. So it was actually pretty good. And the irony of that is, therefore, even though I think my research wasn't that strong, I got called back for quite a few interviews. I guess the confidence really helped because I wasn't trying. And I did get a couple of tenure track jobs. But at that point, I think it was really that, and someone said, why don't you just work and get tenure and then you can do what you want? You know, you really don't. And I said, the problem is I won't get tenure because I wouldn't even be able to make myself do that for 7 or 8 years.
Too many rules, not enough rebellion.
You know, not enough open structure. So I think that was a good decision, I do feel, because I could have, the only thing I do tell people is academia is a one-way street. So, you know, the doors close, and it's, at least in the business academia, it's very hard to go back. Like some economics PhDs, you can get quasi-academic jobs like the World Bank and still go back into academia. And business, you can't. You can't go to Pepsi and then go back into academia. So I tell them, if you're even thinking about it a little bit, then you might want to try it out for a year or two and see. But in my case, I don't think, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks maybe I could have tried it out, but honestly, I don't think. I think my research would have fizzled out, and I don't think that would have worked. So that was the process. It's not encouraged by academia, so it was very much this. I did complete the PhD because I have a completion ethic. I have rarely left, those people who say, I did not finish this book. I'm like, how do you exist? Like, how do you never finish a book that you have started?
That's right. It doesn't matter how bad it is. I will finish that book, man.
The concept of sunk cost, absolutely. I mean, I don't know whether it's sunk cost or whether it's a completion compulsion, but I absolutely will not leave something unfinished. So I think that applied to the PhD. That I was like, there is no way I'm going to do an ABD. Like, I'm going to finish this damn thing. So I did that, but knowing fully well that I wasn't. So somewhere between my maybe third and fourth year, and then it took another year or two just to sink in and sort of make that pivot to like corporate, yeah.
And you pivoted to a very specific sort of place in corporate, right? So you've been on this sort of sales and marketing track, you know, and then post PhD, you really more are in this sort of synthesis insight. Did you sort of knew that? Had you come to realize that about yourself and found the sort of, you know, place that could, you know, how did that manifest?
No, actually that was, I was just put there because they said, oh, you have a PhD, we don't know what to do with you, so we'll put you in whatever the closest thing, which is research and insights. That is literally it. I never thought I would get an insights job. I wasn't looking for an insights job. And I spent all of my time in Pepsi trying to switch over to marketing, by the way. Although I was conflicted there because marketing seemed very much a doer kind of job. It wasn't really, some of the thinking that I'd grown to love in insights wasn't there. So I was stuck again because I was like, I love insights, but it doesn't seem to be feeding the engine of, the business model. Like it's not... that's where marketing sits, but marketing seems to be doing a lot. They don't have the nice intellectual sort of thrill of insight. So like, I couldn't find a good space between those two. But no, it was purely because they said you have a PhD and therefore you're an insights person.
Well, and you know, I think it's a well-made insight about, you know, the marketing folks at Pepsi have a very, I don't know, Steve Jobsian sort of like, I'm right because I know I'm right and because I have good taste. And I sort of like, you know, it's never been a heavy data analytics culture I think it probably is closer now than it was,
now,
but in this, you know, the period you're talking about in the early teens, it was sort of like, I'm a tastemaker and I know what good looks like and I'm going to.
I mean, very much so. And, you know, a lot of the stuff was around the Super Bowl and execution. There are parts to the company that are extremely heavy on analytics, the shopper part, the sales to Walmart and that kind of stuff. But I just couldn't figure out how to get around there. And it just seemed like, oh my God, now, you know, it's going to take forever to do this. So I just kept hanging around. I mean, I enjoyed insights. There wasn't any compulsion that the other thing that I did do, which was the reason I was in Pepsi for 7 years is because when I joined Pepsi, I made a vow to myself that I would stay for 5 years because I'd never stayed in any organization for 5 years. And I wanted to see what would happen if I did that. Would things compound? and I would have more impact? Like, did I leave jobs too soon, before things, so a little bit of an experiment, so to speak, no
Okay,
control group.
Paul. I have
Yeah.
no hypothesis, but I'm just going to
No,
try some
yeah,
shit and see what
yeah,
happens.
exactly. Would I suddenly develop this, like, is that the point at which commitment starts and then you're in for the rest of your, like, I was just curious what happens, because I had a lot of by this time I had been about, I want to say, many years out of business, my Indian business school, and some of my friends had stayed with the same company for like 15 years. And I was just like, wow, what does that feel like? So I said, whatever happens, no matter how bad the work gets, even if there's no work, I'm going to stay at Pepsi for 5 years.
I'm going to run this experiment.
And I think, I think without that commitment, I don't know. I think my natural urge to wander would have asserted itself. I was like, it ends well, because it turns out if you stayed at that point, and I was the last batch at Pepsi for 5 years, you got a tiny little pension. So now for the rest of my life, when I retire, I have that little Neela's commitment reward, staying there. But yeah, no, it was very much this. I really enjoed it, and the nice thing with Pepsi, at least in Insights, is everyone was always willing to try something new. So when I first joined, I joined a new center that had been formed. And Pepsi kept doing this. Every few years, they would reconstitute everything, and there was the sense of constant change. And it was called a Center for Human Understanding, very lofty title. But essentially, the fun part of that was it didn't have to have any into business. Like, we were doing things like, actually, it was interesting. We were doing things like, what happens to an older population, right? Like, as populations age. And I hadn't realized the boomer population was so huge in the United States. So it was pretty interesting to do all that. Pepsi had this fabulous program. I have to commend them for two things. One, they had this absolutely fabulous employer matching program where if you donated to nonprofits, they would match. And at a time when most people were matching, like, if you donated 5,000, they would match, say, 1,000. They were matching twice the amount. So, like, if you donated 10, they would give 20. I mean, I don't know whether they continued with the program, but it was fabulous. So that was kind of like, wow, these people are great. And the second one is that they had this 1 month corporate volunteering stint, which they would send you on. And then, of course, it was quite competitive, and they would pay for, it was completely paid for by the company, plus your salary and everything during the 1 month when you were doing no work for the company except this volunteering stint. So it was pretty good. But the reason I joined Pepsi actually was rooted a little bit in behavioral science, because Indra Nooyi was the CEO at that point. And at first I had a lot of hesitations about joining a soda company. I really wasn't interested. But she had started this idea of performance with purpose and this idea of converting categories into healthier categories. I had spent my entire 5 years, in fact, my dissertation was about what I call mixed indulgences, which is this idea of if you add a bit of utilitarianism to hedonic things versus if you add, hedonic stuff to utility oriented. So chocolate with calcium or calcium with chocolate, the way you frame them, does that change people's, and we did find that if you add utility to pleasure, dampens arousal and, therefore choices that people make in a United States context where pleasure is often associated with sin and guilty pleasures and therefore has a high level of arousal. So I'm looking at this transition, this idea of a company that's largely existed for pleasure, saying we're going to go to healthy options. People tell us they want healthy food, and I'm like, I'm not sure that's going to work that well, because, it's incredibly hard. This is one of the hardest things to do. People say they want healthy options, they never end up choosing those options. So I thought it would be an interesting place to actually see some of the behavioral science theories come to life. And it was, because there was a lot of debate internally, and the results were not often as successful, but there was a lot of investment that went into those products.
Well, and as a guy who flies back and forth to Sri Lanka, I fly through Hong Kong, and in the lounge they always have the like Coke Plus, right? The like Coke with added vitamins that you can find in Asia. And I always am like, this is great, man. It's the thing I would always drink with a little extra whatever. All right, this is.
Yeah, but turns out a lot of people say, don't like, adulterate my Pepsi and my Coke with these vitamins. I just want to keep my vitamins. So it was interesting because you could never predict. And I think that was really, really cool. And then in the last couple of years, this big design center opened up in Pepsi, in Soho actually. And that was really cool because that was the first, I always thought of design as just package design, but that was the first time I actually got to meet people who, like, design was a part of innovation. Human-centered design had just, like, that buzzword was just coming in. So it was a pretty interesting way to look at design, which is not just design, as a function of things, but as sort of something that you put on packaging, but like, the design of machines, the food service machines, the design of, for example, vending machines are often associated with quote unquote junk food. What if you designed healthy vending machines? Would people actually go, or would they actually stay away from them altogether? I don't even want to go there. And lots of questions around design and choice. So that was pretty interesting, actually. So yeah, lots of very interesting things at Pepsi that made me stay there, aside from my commitment to run this experiment.
5 years. But then, you make another pivot, right?
Yeah.
Sort of post Pepsi. And you kind of hinted a little bit at maybe where this can, Pepsi for Good and some of these other sort of places. But what made you say, hey, I'm going to start looking at more sort of NGO type things?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is when I was studying for the PhD, and I went into, I thought I was going to just do marketing, right? So I was like, oh, marketing, consumer behavior. But actually, we did very little of that. It was all people's judgments and choices, right? And so for the first time, when you learn marketing, you're so in that thing of people as consumers, you don't think about them. And I think one of my professors made this really important point. She said, we always say consumers do this. It's not consumers, it's people who do this. And people in their role as consumers do something, but they might have other roles. And I, as someone who'd gone into marketing and been a marketer for many years, just conflated the two. People were consumers only, and we didn't often think. So this idea that we are studying judgments and decisions of people and this idea that behaviors don't only have to do with buying behaviors, but others. I mean, it sounds so stupid in retrospect, but it was really eye-opening again for me because I hadn't really thought about, about that. I'd not thought about behaviors that could apply as much to. So then I'd always had this interest. You grow up in India, you see a lot of poverty. You're like, why aren't there good solutions? Why does this exist? So I'd always thought about it and never gone into that field because I felt it was very touchy-feely. It was too fuzzy, no data, no evidence. So I think that I was like, psychology has brought some degree of measurement to concepts I thought were very fuzzy, including emotions. So, that circumplex model of emotions. I mean, I love that. I was like, I can't believe that you can actually plot, affect and, plot positive, negative and all of these things. And I mean, it's interesting to see that something as fuzzy as emotions that, you can actually say fear is this and it's different from anxiety and anger is different from X. So I found that idea of measurement of fuzzy concepts really interesting. So I'm thinking why are we only doing this with respect to selling, some product? What about getting people to donate to that's also a behavior. How could I use this to run some experiments? So again, Google was my friend. I Googled and I found this actually really interesting organization at that point called Innovations for Poverty Action. And it turned out that they were doing a lot of randomized controlled trials, which is another word for experiments. And they were doing it in the field of, development, and they were testing what works. And again, that was come to Jesus moment. I was like, that was the road to Damascus. I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do, to take that sort of evidence-led development. Again, no way to get there. Because with my marketing background, they were like, cool, you can help us with some fundraising. And I'm like, no, I want to work on programs, not fundraising. But I stayed in touch with them. I was like, listen, you guys, if you have any messaging you want me to take a look at, I have a marketing background. So just remained interested as a donor, as a volunteer. So I think that interest continued throughout Pepsi and the volunteering. And I always thought, what's a way to take what I have to development? So the transition came about so suddenly that when I gave a talk, I think it was at Chicago, one of the professors came to me afterwards and said, you didn't tell us how you made this transition from Pepsi to this work in India. And I said, no, I told you exactly how it happened. He said, no, that can't be true. So what happened was that I had, at that point, Twitter was extremely, it wasn't the toxic mess it is today, right? It was really, really nice. And it had become this sort of emerging ground for people and behavioral scientists, academics, economists, everybody, like, and especially in the nonprofit world, it was a great way to learn about what people are doing. This was around 2016 or so. And so I was a lot on Twitter, and I was like commenting and following and re-upping articles and so on. And then I think I commented on this person's tweet, and he was the CEO, I think, of the Gates Foundation in India. And I said, you know, you might want to think about these things. And the next thing I know is, and this is a tribute to him, and like, you know, so prescient, he just sends me a note. I don't know if he got my email or anything, but maybe from LinkedIn or something, saying, you know, we are setting up the Center for Social and Behaviour Change in India. It looks like your background might be quite interesting. Like, let's chat. And I think, oh, this could be interesting. And I remember telling my husband, oh, that would be cool. I could do this as an advisor along with my Pepsi job. At least it'll give me more meaning, etc. At that point, I was literally saying, I'll take a sabbatical. I'll do volunteer things. I'll do stuff. So one thing led to another. And then he was like, do you want to come to India and run this? And this is where I have to give my husband credit, because for me, it was too big a leap. You know, what? I'm going to move from like this well-paying job with stock options to like doing this. I mean, it sounds like a dream, but like to doing this in India that I've left voluntarily, like, why would I do this? And he said to me, he said, you've been thinking about this for so long. You talk about it all the time, all your spare time. You are, you know, volunteering with IPA and doing things and so on. He said, you should do it. So I said, yeah, I'll think about it. The next day he comes and says, I spoke to my boss, and he says I could get a transfer to India. And then our daughter was in elementary school, and the third day he's like, oh, and I called up the American school in Delhi, and it turns out that so like there were no objections. At that point, it would have been foolish for me to say, like, so that's how it
inhibiting pressures, man. You know,
yeah.
Promoting pressures, just gotta lower them inhibiting pressures.
That's what he did. He didn't do anything to try and persuade me or to say, oh, this is so great. He's just like, okay, what are your objections? Okay, you know, you're worried that what will happen to my career. I got the transfer. You're worried about school. Done.
Solved.
Okay, you know, what else? So that's what happened. And my only takeaway from that is it's all serendipity. Like, you can never plan careers. You just can't. You just have to be open, totally open to what comes next. So that was a big pivot, and that was the defining thing, because the center was set up to essentially bring it was set up to actually to bring evidence-led communication. That was the initial. So actually the name of the center was the Center for Social and Behaviour Change Communication. That was the name in which the grant had come. And I said, is there any reason that communication is mentioned in the title of the center? They said, no. I said, because, you know, a lot of behavior choice, communication is a big part, but it's not the only part, because, you know, we all know about the intent to action gap. And I said, can we remove communication, just make it the Center for Social and Behaviour Change, because communication is a way into that change. It's not the change itself. And they said, yeah, I guess we could. And so I see that as my first win, which was to say, you know, and then behavior science, at that point, they weren't thinking of it. So the Gates Foundation had basically funded this center, and they said, okay, we recognize that there is a need. And I think what they had found in India was that despite putting a lot of money into vaccines and such, they weren't getting a lot of uptake. So the idea was, what are we doing on the demand side that's not working? And so that was the start to like sort of doing a lot of very interesting work around essentially what became behavioral science for development.
That's amazing. And it is, I mean, to your point, it's it's not luck per se, right? You did tweet. I mean, there was action, there was behavior.
It's not luck, But it is engineered. It is engineered luck. Like, it's like,
But there was some openness on your side to this serendipitous, and apparently on your husband's side, to this serendipity.
Yeah, I mean, you have that. I think that for me has always been the defining point of a career. If you want to have a career where you're not quite sure what you do next, you've got to put in a lot of seeds everywhere. And that's a lot of uncertainty. So the downside to that is, it takes a lot of cognitive mind space, because everything is a yes, nothing is a no. And sometimes people tell you need to, I'm not quite sure whether you need to focus and subtract versus need to add, because there is an advantage, at least in my case, to adding rather than subtracting, but there's a cost to doing that as well. It worked out well for me at that point, but maybe it would just have made me distracted and I would have been thrown out of my job or something. But it didn't work out. It worked out well, yeah.
So then, you go through this wonderful process. You've pivoted over, right? You end up coming back to the US, right?
Yeah.
Coming back to Yale, right? Making your way back to the States, and then leaving Yale, right?
Yes.
And starting to think about doing some more private consulting,
Yeah.
starting to look at that private sector. What about the private sector has like renewed interest for you these days?
Yeah. So, coming back just to, again, lots of other similar theme, putting lots of stakes, little seeds around. The Yale opportunity came because I'd worked with the professor Mushfiq Mubarak on a big study, and we had never met in person because the study was conducted during the pandemic. But he, I guess, trusted my work enough to say, "Hey, I have the center. Are you interested in running it?" It's an economic center. I had not done economics since undergrad, and but I think he was prescient enough. He was sharp enough to know that he didn't want another economist. He wanted someone with a different skill set. Anyway, so that was really enjoyable. It was about the science of scaling. So I left yesterday just because I think I've been there 4.5 years. We've built it now to a point from nothing from the start to a point where there is really solid unrestricted funding and a pipeline of projects. And really, I said if I had to leave, this was a moment to do that. I'm not leaving it in a bad shape. On the contrary, and there's work to be done, but the people are in place. My work is almost finished here. I'd just be cruising now if I had to continue. It was the right time to look at something. So I think that my goal has not changed from 2017, which is when I went into the social impact space, which is how can we solve these big, huge problems of horrible extreme poverty that exists in the rest of the world, which I've seen and I know you've seen firsthand. How can we solve that? But the means to do that could be in many different ways. It could be that as a behavioral scientist with some knowledge of this, I could advise NGOs who run programs as to how they can better run programs, right? And I loved your slide on the business model. I'm going to think about that now, the operational model, the business model, the behavior model. So that could be one way to do that. But another way to do that would be, and I think this is especially given my private sector view, is that development doesn't need to be about grants and grant-based funding. In fact, the most sustainable development has to be about job creation. And that's where the private sector has a role to play. And the most sustainable job creation is when there is profit. I mean, the classic Adam Smith, right? We all work in self-interest. The problem that's happened is that profits become like obscene. The enshittification, as Cory Doctorow calls it, happens. And then, people say, oh, this is a horrible model, but the model is okay. It's just that it's just it's used in terrible ways and it's unregulated. So equally legitimate as saying I could provide behavioral science expertise to NGOs would be a path to say, what would a good private sector model of providing jobs and livelihoods, maybe private sector combined with government sector. And in fact, one of the projects I'm working on is what is called the graduation model, which is you provide people with an asset, savings coaching, some training on how to use that, and basically the idea is that they can generate income, right? Now, that is very much a grant-funded model because you're talking about the poorest of the poor, so they're not going to get loans. But you could just as well see models where you give loans to people or models where you set up jobs. So I think the goal of poverty alleviation has not changed, but there could be different ways and that's what I'm going to spend some time in the next few months thinking about. Where can my skills, private sector, implementation, behavioral science, and my interests, which is development, poverty alleviation in the rest of the world, best have a fit? And what should I then, devote some chunk of time to doing?
Yeah, I think it's a really prescient point. I mean, obviously, at Oceans, we employ 600 Sri Lankans, right? And we didn't, USAID dried up and we didn't, right? We can, and it's it's $1 million a month of cash infusion, into an economy that needs it.
One of the, I co-wrote a book on dignity, right? With a development person and professor at Wharton. And that theme is like people, it's not just work is not just a way to, so I do appreciate unconditional cash transfer. They're not a substitute sometimes for work. People do derive meaning and identity from contributing to something. They don't always just want something for free. To do that, yes, it can give you a good head start, but I'm not sure that there is a world in which that people always want to get a cash assistance for the rest of their life, and maybe people do want to work. We don't know. So I do think that beyond the paycheck, it also provides ways to engage, ways to be seen as an equal. We talk about recognition, equality, and agency as three pillars of dignity. And so you would think that work often gives you that. It gives you recognition of you as a whole person. It offers you the agency to change your life trajectory, through your own methods. And it makes you more equal because you are providing services, valuable services in exchange for a wage, which sometimes, just an unconditional transfer may not always get there, right? Although it is one of the more, I think, dignity enhancing interventions versus I'm going to tell you what I want to do and you're just I'm going to tell you what but I don't want the vitamin C, I don't want the play pumps that you're giving me. No, you have to do it. So I think that jobs, we should be doing more of that thinking. How can we have good jobs and multiply them in countries as a way, how can we bring some of that and scale some of that work? So.